The wind that moves across the plains of northwestern Anatolia carries little memory of cities. It passes through dry grass, over shallow river valleys, and along the low rise of Hisarlik, where the earth looks unremarkable at first glance. Yet beneath this quiet hill lies a place that once burned so intensely in human imagination that its echoes still shape how ancient history is told. Somewhere within these layers of soil and broken stone, a city once held walls, homes, storerooms, and the fragile order of a society that believed itself secure. And then, at a moment still debated, it began to fall apart. There is no single sound preserved from that collapse, no surviving voice to confirm how it began. What remains instead are traces of ash embedded in earth, collapsed masonry, scattered objects abandoned in haste, the kind of archaeological silence that feels heavier than absence, as if the ground itself refuses to fully explain what happened. This is Troy, not as myth first describes it, but as a place repeatedly built, destroyed, and rebuilt again across thousands of years. A city that does not belong to a single moment, but to a long accumulation of human ambition and failure. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At its most famous level, Troy is associated with a war told in epic poetry, a conflict shaped by gods and heroes, by a wooden horse, and a city brought low through deception. But the earth beneath Hisarlik does not preserve epics. It preserves structures, pottery, tools, and destruction layers that speak in a quieter language. Archaeology begins where mythology ends, and in Troy's case, the gap between the two is both revealing and unsettling. The city that likely inspired the Iliad was not a singular stage for legendary figures, but a deeply stratified settlement that endured for millennia, adapting to shifting powers across the ancient Aegean world. The earliest layers of habitation here stretch back into the early Bronze Age, long before the classical world formed its image of Troy. Small communities first settled this hill because of its commanding view over the plains and its proximity to critical waterways. From the beginning, geography shaped destiny. Control this point, and one could monitor movement between continents, ignore it, and others would take advantage. Over time, these advantages became foundations for wealth, and wealth became a reason for conflict. Yet even this explanation feels too simple when one stands in the imagination of what Troy must have been. Not a single city, but a living sequence of cities stacked atop one another, each new generation building over the ruins of the last. Walls were raised, collapsed, and raised again. Streets shifted position. Fortifications expanded. The hill itself became an archive of human persistence, each layer recording a different political reality, a different moment of stability or crisis. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that the settlement was never static. It expanded during periods of trade, contracted during times of pressure, and sometimes suffered sudden destruction that forced complete rebuilding. These cycles are not unusual for ancient cities, but Troy's position made each cycle more consequential. It sat at the edge of worlds, where Anatolia meets the Aegean, where land routes intersect with maritime passage. Every shift in regional power would have reached it directly. The earliest excavations in the 19th century would later complicate this picture dramatically. What was once thought to be a single legendary city began to appear instead as a deep sequence of cultural phases, some peaceful, some violent, many poorly understood. Early archaeologists, driven by the desire to find the Troy of Homer, sometimes misread these layers, collapsing centuries of history into a single narrative. But the soil resisted such simplification. It insisted on complexity. Even now, scholars still debate how to interpret the earliest destruction layers. Some show clear signs of fire, others appear more like abandonment followed by decay. A few suggest structural collapse that could be linked to seismic activity. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern across all levels. What is clear is that Troy's early history is not a single story of rise and fall, but a repeated cycle of adaptation under pressure. And yet, beneath all these layers, there is a constant presence continuity. People always returned after destruction, after abandonment, after uncertainty. New inhabitants built again on the same ground. Something about this location remained irresistible, as if the geography itself exerted a quiet pull across generations. That persistence would become one of the defining features of Troy's long existence, long before it ever entered myth. As the settlement grew, so did its importance. It became more than a village on a hill. It evolved into a point of control over movement, trade, and communication between regions that were becoming increasingly interconnected. This transformation would set the stage for everything that followed, including the conflicts remembered in legend and the archaeological puzzles that still remain unresolved. Beneath the calm modern landscape, the city continues to exist as a layered presence. Not one Troy, but many. Not a single war, but multiple episodes of tension, destruction, and rebuilding. And somewhere within these layers, the origins of its greatest mystery begin to take shape, not as myth, but as accumulated human reality preserved in earth and stone. Beneath the quiet rise of Hisarlik, where modern wind brushes over dry grass and scattered stones, the hill hides something far more unsettling than a single ruined city. It hides time folded onto itself, compressed into a dense archaeological record where centuries do not lie in order but in accumulation. Each layer is a decision made by people who once believed their world was stable enough to last, only to be replaced by another generation standing on the same ground. unaware that they were building on someone else's ending. Troy is not a place in the usual sense. It is a vertical history of human ambition. What makes this stratigraphy so remarkable is not just its depth, but its continuity. Archaeologists have identified at least 10 major settlement phases, often labelled Troy 1 through Troy 10, each representing a different stage of occupation, destruction, or transformation. Some layers are thick with evidence of daily life storage jars embedded in domestic floors, hearths still marked by ash, tools left where they were last used. Others are thin and violent, marked by collapse, burning, and sudden abandonment. Together, they form a record that resists simplification. At the base of this sequence lie the earliest known settlements, dating back to the early Bronze Age, around the 3rd millennium BCE. These were not cities in the later sense, but fortified communities, compact and pragmatic, built with mud brick walls and stone foundations. Life here would have been shaped by proximity to land and water routes, with small-scale agriculture supported by trade in raw materials like obsidian, copper, and wool, even at this early stage. Troy's location already mattered. It was not accidental, or it was strategic. The hill overlooks the narrow approach to the Dardanelles, a waterway that connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and ultimately to the Black Sea. Long before written history records the significance of this passage, human groups understood its value instinctively. Whoever controlled movement through this corridor controlled exchange between continents, goods, ideas, and people all passed through here, and Troy sat like a gatekeeper at the threshold. Over time, the role would define both its prosperity and its vulnerability. As settlement layers accumulate upward, Troy begins to show signs of increasing complexity. In the Middle Bronze Age phases, particularly Troy 2 and 3, the archaeological record reveals more substantial fortifications. Massive stone walls appear, sometimes reinforced with towers and gateways designed to regulate access. Inside these walls, evidence suggests a growing social hierarchy. Larger houses cluster near the centre, while smaller dwellings occupy peripheral zones. Storage facilities become more organised, implying administrative control over surplus goods. This is no longer a simple settlement, it is a structured community managing resources at scale. One of the most striking discoveries from these layers is the presence of finely crafted metal objects, including weapons, jewellery, and tools. Their craftsmanship indicates not only technical skill, but also access to wider trade networks. Copper and tin, necessary for bronze production, were not locally abundant in the immediate region, meaning they had to be imported from distant sources. This alone places Troy within a much larger economic system that connected Anatolia to Mesopotamia. The Caucasus and the Aegean world, the city was not isolated, it was integrated. Yet integration also brought dependency. As Troy's economy grew more complex, it became more sensitive to disruption. A break in trade routes, a shift in regional power, or a conflict elsewhere could ripple through its stability. Archaeological layers suggest that periods of prosperity were often followed by abrupt changes in construction style, defensive emphasis, or settlement density. These shifts imply that Troy was constantly adapting to external pressures. Even if those pressures are not always visible in the record, among the most debated layers is Troy 2, which contains both architectural sophistication and evidence of catastrophic destruction. Massive walls with projecting towers suggest a well-organised defensive system, while within the same layer, archaeologists found signs of intense burning. Collapsed structures, scorched surfaces, and scattered artefacts suggest a violent end. Early excavators, especially Heinrich Schliemann, would later associate this layer with the legendary city of Priam described in Homeric tradition. However, modern chronology places Troy several centuries earlier than the traditional time frame of the Trojan War, creating a major interpretive problem. This mismatch between myth and archaeology is one of the central tensions in Troy's study. The desire to align physical evidence with epic narrative led early researchers to interpret destruction layers as single dramatic events, often overlooking the long gaps between them. But as excavation methods improved, it became clear that Troy did not experience one great fall. It experienced many smaller collapses, some local, some regional, and some still unexplained. The hill itself seems to record violence in multiple forms. Some destruction layers show clear signs of warfare arrowheads embedded in walls, weapons left behind in defensive positions, and burn patterns consistent with attack. Others are more ambiguous, lacking clear human indicators. In some cases, entire buildings appear to have collapsed inward without evidence of invasion, suggesting earthquakes or structural failure. This ambiguity is crucial. It prevents any single narrative from fully dominating Troy's history. As the settlement progresses into later Bronze Age phases, particularly Troy 6 and 7, the city reaches its architectural and cultural peak. Massive stone walls with sloping bases dominate the landscape, designed to withstand both human attack and seismic activity. These fortifications are among the most impressive in the Aegean world of their time. Inside the walls, the settlement appears more organised, with carefully planned streets, storage buildings, and residential zones. This is a city at its most confident stage. Troy 6, in particular, has often been associated with prosperity. Imported pottery from Mycenaean Greece appears alongside local Anatolian styles, indicating active exchange. Livestock remains suggest a mixed economy of farming and animal husbandry. Everything points to a settlement deeply embedded in regional networks of trade and diplomacy. It is easy to imagine this version of Troy as a powerful regional centre, not unlike other late Bronze Age citadels of the Eastern Mediterranean. And yet, even at its height, instability is never far away. Some walls show signs of repair that differ in technique from earlier construction, suggesting either rapid rebuilding or shifting labour resources. Certain areas appear to have been abandoned and reoccupied. These subtle changes hint at underlying pressures that are not fully visible in the material record. Scholars still debate whether these changes reflect internal political tension, external threats, or environmental stress. Then comes the transition into Troy 7, a phase that introduces a more fragmented and difficult to interpret record. This is where the archaeological narrative begins to intersect most closely with the traditional timeline of the Trojan War. Evidence from this layer includes signs of overcrowding within the walls, suggesting that populations from surrounding areas may have sought refuge inside the city. Storage capacity appears strained, and building quality becomes more uneven. These patterns often indicate a community under stress, possibly due to external conflict or regional instability. Within this same layer, archaeologists have found destruction deposits that include fire damage and scattered human remains. However, the scale and nature of this destruction are not uniform. Some areas appear heavily affected, while others remain relatively intact. This uneven pattern has led to competing interpretations. Some scholars suggest a short but intense conflict, possibly involving a siege. Others argue for a combination of earthquake damage followed by opportunistic violence. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. What makes this phase particularly compelling is not just the destruction itself, but what comes after. Unlike some sites that are permanently abandoned following collapse, Troy is rebuilt again, life returns, new structures emerge, often reusing older foundations. The city persists, even in reduced form. This resilience complicates any simple narrative of total destruction. By the end of the Bronze Age sequence, Troy is no longer the powerful fortified centre it once was. Its influence diminishes, its architecture simplifies, and its role in regional networks shifts. Yet it does not vanish entirely. Instead, it transitions into smaller phases of occupation that continue into the Iron Age and beyond, eventually becoming part of the classical world known to later Greek historians. Through all these layers, one fact remains constant. Troy is never just one city. It is a process of repeated human occupation shaped by geography, trade, conflict, and survival. Each layer preserves not only evidence of destruction, but also evidence of return, and it is this cycle more than any single war or myth that defines the true nature of the site. As the soil continues to yield its fragments of pottery, ash, and stone, the story of Troy becomes less about a singular legendary event and more about the long endurance of a place that refused to remain empty. Beneath the surface, the hill holds not just ruins, but continuity disguised as ruin. The landscape around Troy does not announce its importance. From a distance, the plains of northwestern Anatolia appear almost indifferent, shaped by wind, seasonal drought, and long stretches of open land that seem to lead nowhere in particular. Yet this apparent emptiness is deceptive. For thousands of years, this was a region of movement rather than stillness, where routes converged naturally along the narrow corridor between seas and continents. And at the centre of that corridor stood a hill that would become one of the most contested points in early human geography. Troy's significance cannot be understood without its geography, because geography is what made the site meaningful long before any myth attached itself to it. The Dardanelles, a narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, functions as one of the most critical maritime passages in the Eastern Mediterranean. Even in antiquity, it was a bottleneck. Ships could not bypass it. Land routes funneled toward it. Control over this passage meant control over movement between Europe and Asia, between inland Anatolia and the wider maritime world. Troy sits not directly on the water, but close enough to observe and influence movement along the approaches to the strait. This slight elevation above the plain gave it a strategic advantage that is easy to underestimate today, but would have been decisive in the ancient world. From the hill, one could monitor movement across both land and river systems, tracking caravans, herds, and military activity long before they reached the coast. In practical terms, Troy functioned as an early warning point and a potential control hub for exchange routes. Over time, this position shaped everything about the settlement's development. The accumulation of wealth in Troy was not accidental. It emerged from the simple fact that movement creates opportunity. Goods passing through the region could be taxed, traded, redirected, or stored. Information passed along these routes could be intercepted or relayed. Even conflict in distant regions could affect Troy indirectly by shifting the flow of trade. The city's prosperity was therefore never fully stable. It was tied to forces beyond its immediate control. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Across multiple settlement layers, imported goods appear in significant quantities. Pottery styles from the Aegean region, metal objects consistent with Anatolian production centres, and even materials traceable to more distant sources all appear within Troy's occupational strata. These finds indicate that the city was not isolated but deeply embedded in a network of exchange that stretched across the late Bronze Age world. Some of the most revealing evidence comes not from luxury goods but from ordinary materials. Animal remains suggest standardised patterns of herding and consumption, implying organised supply systems. Storage vessels of similar design appear across different layers, indicating continuity in administrative practices. Even the layout of streets and buildings in certain phases suggests planning that goes beyond spontaneous settlement growth. These details point toward a society that understood its role as a hub of controlled exchange. Yet control over geography is never absolute. The same routes that brought wealth also brought vulnerability. Any shift in regional power could disrupt the flow of goods and people. Competing centres of influence in Anatolia, the Aegean and beyond, would have periodically challenged Troy's position. In such a dynamic environment, even a strong settlement could find itself under pressure without warning. This tension between opportunity and risk is reflected subtly in the archaeological record. Fortification walls are rebuilt multiple times across different phases, sometimes expanded, sometimes reinforced, sometimes altered in response to new threats. These changes suggest not only growth, but adaptation to uncertainty. A city positioned at a crossroads cannot afford complacency. It is within this geographic reality that the later mythological interpretation of Troy begins to make sense. The Iliad, composed centuries after the late Bronze Age events it may loosely reflect, presents Troy as a wealthy and desirable city worth fighting over. While the poem transforms history into narrative shaped by gods and heroes, its underlying assumption aligns with the archaeological reality. Control over Troy meant control over something valuable. However, it is important to separate the symbolic Troy of epic tradition from the physical settlement revealed by excavation. The epic narrative compresses time, simplifies political complexity, and focuses on a single dramatic conflict. The archaeological Troy, by contrast, reveals repeated cycles of development, destruction, and rebuilding. There is no evidence of a single total war matching the scale described in later literary sources. Instead, there are multiple episodes of instability spread across centuries. One of the more subtle insights provided by geography is how it influences perception. To outside observers, particularly later Greek storytellers, Troy may have appeared as a distant, powerful city guarding a critical passage. But to its inhabitants, it was likely a place of constant negotiation, where survival depended on managing relationships with surrounding communities and adapting to shifting economic conditions. The difference between myth and reality is not necessarily contradiction, but scale. Within the broader late Bronze Age world, Troy was not unique in its strategic importance. Other cities across Anatolia and the Aegean also occupied key positions along trade routes and coastal corridors. What distinguishes Troy is the density of its occupational history and the way its archaeological record became entangled with later literary tradition. Few sites in the ancient world carry such a strong dual identity, one grounded in material evidence, the other in enduring cultural memory. The physical landscape itself also plays a role in shaping the settlement's character. The plains surrounding Hisarlik are fertile but exposed, with limited natural barriers. This makes the hilltop position even more significant, as elevation provides both visibility and defensibility. Rivers in the region shift over time, altering access to water and changing the dynamics of local agriculture. These environmental factors contribute to the cycles of growth and contraction seen in the archaeological record. Climate variability may also have influenced Troy's development. Evidence from broader regional studies suggests that the late Bronze Age experienced periods of environmental stress, including fluctuations in rainfall and temperature. While Troy's local impact remains difficult to isolate, such changes could have affected agricultural output, trade reliability, and population stability. Even small environmental shifts can have cascading effects in a system dependent on exchange and storage. Despite these pressures, Troy repeatedly demonstrates resilience. Each phase of occupation adapts to new conditions, whether through architectural changes, economic adjustments, or shifts in settlement density. This adaptability is one of the most consistent features of the site. Rather than a static city rising and falling in a single narrative arc, Troy behaves more like a living system responding to long-term regional dynamics. This perspective begins to challenge older interpretations that sought to explain Troy primarily through the lens of heroic conflict. Instead of asking what single event caused its destruction, a more grounded question emerges: how did a settlement in such a critical location persist for so long despite repeated disruptions? The answer appears to lie not in singular moments of catastrophe, but in the ability to recover, rebuild, and reposition itself within changing networks. Even in its later phases, when its prominence declines, Troy does not disappear from the map of human activity. It continues to exist in reduced but persistent forms, eventually becoming part of the classical Greek cultural imagination. By that point, its physical reality has already been transformed into something larger than itself, a symbol of endurance, conflict, and memory. And yet, beneath all these layers of interpretation, geographical, archaeological, and mythological, the hill remains what it has always been: a fixed point in a shifting world, a place where movement converges, where pressures accumulate, and where human societies repeatedly attempt to secure stability in an environment defined by change. The geography of Troy does not explain everything, but it explains enough to reveal why this particular hill became so difficult to forget. It is not the story alone that keeps Troy alive in historical memory. It is the land itself, shaping every generation that tried to inhabit it. Long before any archaeological trench cut into the soil of Hisarlik, Troy already existed in the human imagination as something larger than its physical remains. It lived in stories carried across generations, shaped not by excavation, but by memory, performance, and repetition. In these oral traditions, the city was not a layered settlement built over millennia, but a single monumental stage where fate, pride, and conflict collided in a final, irreversible moment. That transformation from place to myth would eventually define how the ancient world and much of the modern one understood it. The Iliad, the most famous literary source associated with Troy, does not describe a city in archaeological detail. Instead, it presents a world structured by heroic codes, divine intervention, and compressed time. Battles unfold across days that feel like symbols rather than historical chronology. Kings speak in elevated language that reflects cultural memory more than recorded speech. And at the centre of this narrative stands Troy, a city both real and enlarged beyond its physical boundaries. What makes the Iliad particularly significant is not its accuracy in a modern historical sense, but its preservation of older traditions. The poem likely reached its written form in the 8th century BCE, long after the Late Bronze Age events it may partially echo. By then, the world it describes had already changed dramatically. Entire political systems had collapsed and reformed. Writing systems had been lost and reintroduced. Yet fragments of earlier memories appear to survive within the narrative, embedded like fossils in storytelling. One of the most persistent questions in the study of Troy is how much historical truth, if any, lies behind this epic framework. The answer is neither simple confirmation nor complete dismissal. Archaeology suggests that a real fortified settlement existed at Hisarlik during the Late Bronze Age, and that it experienced periods of destruction and rebuilding. But there is no evidence of a single, large-scale conflict matching the 10-year war described in later tradition. Instead, what likely survives in the epic is a distant reflection of multiple smaller conflicts condensed into a unified narrative over centuries of oral transmission. This process of condensation is crucial to understanding how myth forms. Oral traditions do not preserve events like written records. They reshape them. Details that are culturally significant are preserved. While chronological precision fades, separate events may merge into one. Different figures may become representations of a single archetype. Over time, the story becomes less about what happened and more about what it means. In Troy's case, that meaning revolves around themes of wealth, conflict, and the fragility of fortified power. Within this framework, Troy becomes more than a city. It becomes a symbol of resistance and eventual downfall. Its walls are described as massive and near mythical in strength. Its wealth is portrayed as vast and desirable. Its fall becomes a narrative necessity, a conclusion that satisfies the structure of epic storytelling. Yet when placed alongside the archaeological record, these descriptions appear exaggerated, shaped by literary convention rather than material evidence. The archaeological site itself offers no indication of a single, dramatic breach followed by total destruction of the kind described in epic poetry. Instead, as earlier layers show, there are multiple episodes of damage, repair, and rebuilding. Some are caused by fire, others by structural collapse, and still others remain ambiguous. The gap between these realities and the literary account is not a flaw in either source, but a reminder that they operate in different domains of understanding. The tension between myth and material evidence became especially pronounced during the early excavations of the site in the 19th century. When Heinrich Schliemann began his work at Hisarlik, he was driven by a conviction that the Iliad preserved a historical memory waiting to be uncovered. His approach was shaped by this expectation, leading him to interpret archaeological layers through the lens of Homeric narrative. In doing so, he helped establish Troy as a real place in the modern imagination, but also introduced interpretive distortions that would take decades to correct. Schliemann's identification of what he called Priam's treasure is one of the most famous examples of this tension. Discovered in a layer that he believed corresponded to the Homeric city, the collection of gold and artifacts was immediately associated with the legendary king of Troy. However, later analysis revealed that these objects belonged to a much earlier period, likely several centuries before the traditional time frame of the Trojan War. This misattribution highlights a recurring problem in early archaeology, the tendency to align material finds too closely with literary expectations. Despite these errors, Schliemann's work had a lasting impact. It confirmed that Hisarlik was not a random hill, but a site of deep historical significance. Subsequent excavations refined the chronology and revealed the complexity of the settlement layers. What emerged was not a single heroic city, but a sequence of cities, each with its own architecture, economy, and fate. This realization fundamentally changed how scholars approached the relationship between myth and history. Another important aspect of the Homeric tradition is its selective focus. The Iliad does not attempt to describe the full structure of Troy or its society. Instead, it concentrates on a narrow segment of time, framed by the emotional and symbolic weight of conflict. Daily life within the city is largely absent. The administrative systems, trade networks, and social hierarchies that archaeology reveals are not central to the narrative. This absence is not accidental. It reflects the priorities of epic storytelling, which privileges drama over documentation. Yet archaeology restores what the poem omits. Within the layers of Troy 6 and 7, evidence of ordinary life becomes visible. Storage vessels suggest long-term planning and surplus management. Domestic structures reveal patterns of family life and household organisation. Imported goods indicate participation in broader trade networks. These details paint a picture of a functioning urban centre, not just a fortress defined by war. This contrast between narrative focus and material reality raises an important interpretive challenge. The Troy of literature is defined by a single event, while the Troy of archaeology is defined by continuity. One compresses time into drama, the other expands it into accumulation. Neither fully replaces the other, but together they reveal how human societies remember the past through different lenses. The transformation of Troy into myth also reflects broader cultural processes in the ancient Mediterranean world. Stories of great cities falling in dramatic conflict are not unique to Greek tradition. Similar narrative patterns appear in Near Eastern literature, where cities are often portrayed as rising to greatness before being brought low by divine or human forces. These shared motifs suggest that Troy's story is part of a wider tradition of interpreting urban vulnerability through narrative structure. Over time, the Homeric version of Troy became detached from its archaeological context and entered a symbolic domain. In later Greek thought, Troy represented not just a historical location, but a foundational episode in cultural identity. It marked a transition between mythical past and emerging historical consciousness. Even as historians and poets debated its details, its significance remained stable. This symbolic endurance is one of the reasons Troy continues to attract attention. It is not only what the city was, but what it became in collective memory. Few archaeological sites carry such a strong dual existence, simultaneously grounded in physical remains and elevated into literary tradition. That duality ensures that every new discovery at Hisarlik is interpreted through multiple layers of meaning. As excavation continues to refine the material record, the gap between myth and archaeology does not disappear, but it becomes more structured. Instead of seeking to confirm or deny the Iliad, scholars increasingly focus on understanding how both systems of knowledge developed in parallel, one rooted in lived experience and material survival, the other in narrative transformation and cultural memory. Troy, therefore, exists in two overlapping realities. One is buried in the soil of Anatolia, layered, fragmented, and subject to scientific interpretation. The other is embedded in the structure of storytelling, shaped by centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. Neither can fully replace the other, but together they form a more complete, if still incomplete, understanding of what Troy represents. And somewhere between these two versions, the city of Earth and the city of story, the real Troy remains partially hidden. Not as a single moment of glory or destruction, but as a long sequence of human attempts to build permanence in a world that rarely allowed it. The moment Heinrich Schliemann began digging into the hill of Hisarlik, Troy stopped being only a story and became a contested physical object again. But what he uncovered was not a clean confirmation of Homeric legend. It was something far more complicated, and in many ways more unsettling, a dense accumulation of cities, each one misaligned with expectation, each one forcing reinterpretation of what Troy actually was. Schliemann arrived in the late 19th century with a conviction that bordered on certainty. He believed the Iliad was not just inspired by history, but anchored in it, and that careful excavation would reveal the exact city described in epic poetry. This belief shaped everything that followed. His work was driven not only by curiosity, but by urgency, as if the truth of Troy could be extracted before it faded again into the soil. The excavation process itself was aggressive by modern standards. Large sections of the hill were removed quickly in order to reach deeper layers, a method that prioritized dramatic discovery over careful stratigraphy. In doing so, Schliemann unintentionally destroyed portions of the very record that could have clarified Troy's sequence more precisely. What remained was still extraordinary, but incomplete in ways that archaeology would later struggle to repair. One of the earliest major discoveries was a collection of gold and precious objects that Schliemann famously labelled Priam's treasure. The find immediately captured global attention. It appeared to confirm the existence of a wealthy, powerful city similar to the one described in myth. Jewellery, weapons, and ceremonial items suggested a level of craftsmanship and wealth that seemed to align with epic imagination. Yet almost immediately, questions arose. The layer in which the treasure was found didn't match the expected time frame of the Trojan War tradition. Instead, it belonged to a much earlier phase of settlement, likely Troy II, dating centuries before the Late Bronze Age context associated with Homeric narratives. This discrepancy created a fundamental problem. The most famous proof of Homeric Troy was not actually from Homeric Troy at all. Modern analysis has since confirmed this mismatch. The treasure is real, but its association with Priam is symbolic rather than historical. It belongs to a different Troy, one of the earlier fortified settlements that existed long before the events described in later tradition. This realization did not diminish the importance of the find, but it reshaped its meaning entirely. Instead of confirming a legend, it revealed how easily archaeological interpretation can be shaped by expectation. Beyond the treasure, Schliemann's excavation exposed a more profound truth. Troy is not a single archaeological layer, but a stack of civilizations compressed into one location. Each layer represents a distinct community with its own architecture, economy, and relationship to the surrounding world. What had once been imagined as one city revealed itself as many cities occupying the same strategic hill over thousands of years. Subsequent excavations refined this picture significantly. Later, archaeologists introduced more precise methods, carefully recording stratigraphy and distinguishing between occupation phases. This work revealed that Troy's history is not a simple rise and fall, but a complex cycle of expansion, destruction, rebuilding, and adaptation. Some layers show continuity, while others show abrupt breaks. Some transitions are gradual, others sudden and violent. Troy 6, for example, represents one of the most architecturally impressive phases. Its massive stone walls, constructed with a slight inward slope, suggest advanced engineering designed to resist both human attack and seismic activity. Inside these walls, the settlement appears organised and prosperous. Imported pottery, standardised domestic structures, and evidence of administrative storage all point to a stable and connected urban centre. This phase is often considered one of the strongest candidates for a historical Trojan War context, although no direct evidence confirms a single, large-scale siege. Instead, what appears in the record are signs of tension and possible localized conflict. Some damage to structures could indicate warfare, but it could also result from earthquakes, which are common in the region. The ambiguity remains one of the most discussed aspects of Troy's archaeological interpretation. Then comes Troy 7, a phase that shifts the tone of the record noticeably. Here, archaeologists find signs of overcrowding within the fortified area. Houses appear more densely packed, storage systems strained, and architectural quality somewhat reduced compared to earlier phases. These patterns often suggest a population under pressure, possibly due to external instability in the wider region. Within this same layer, there is evidence of destruction by fire and scattered human remains. However, the distribution of damage is uneven. Some parts of the settlement show intense destruction, while others remain relatively intact. This inconsistency complicates any attempt to define a single cause. Whether this represents warfare, internal collapse, or environmental catastrophe remains unresolved. What is particularly important about Troy 7 is not just its destruction, but its aftermath. Unlike sites that are abandoned permanently following collapse, Troy is reoccupied, new structures appear, often built directly over older remains. This continuity suggests that even after disruption, the location itself retained value. People returned, rebuilt, and adapted once again to the same geographic conditions that had shaped earlier settlements. This pattern of return is one of the most consistent features of Troy's long history. It suggests that the site was never simply a victim of destruction, but part of a long-term cycle of occupation shaped by enduring strategic importance. Even when political or economic systems shifted, the hill itself remained relevant. In the broader context of the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, Troy was not isolated in experiencing instability. Many major civilizations in the region underwent periods of disruption during the same general time frame. Palace systems collapsed in some areas, trade networks weakened in others, and population movements reshaped entire regions. Troy's later phases appear to overlap with this wider pattern of transformation. However, connecting Troy directly to the broader Bronze Age collapse remains complex. While there are parallels in timing and general conditions, there is no evidence that Troy alone triggered or defined this larger systemic change. Instead, it appears to have been one site among many affected by shifting regional dynamics. Its experience reflects broader trends rather than singular causation. One of the most challenging aspects of interpreting Troy is the difficulty of distinguishing between different types of destruction. Fire, earthquake, warfare, and abandonment can sometimes produce similar archaeological signatures. Without clear written records from the site itself, each interpretation must rely on indirect evidence. This creates space for multiple competing explanations, none of which fully account for all observed data. Earthquakes, in particular, are a strong candidate for at least some destruction phases. The region is seismically active, and structural collapse patterns in certain layers are consistent with seismic damage. However, other layers show signs more typical of human conflict, such as weapon fragments and defensive positioning. It is possible that multiple causes operated at different times, rather than a single explanation applying universally. What emerges from this complexity is a picture of Troy not as a city destroyed once, but as a settlement repeatedly tested by different forms of instability. Each destruction layer represents not an end, but a transition. In some cases, that transition leads to rebuilding. In others, it leads to decline, but the pattern itself is continuous. Schliemann's early interpretation, shaped by the desire to find a single Homeric city, could not easily accommodate this complexity. His vision required a clear narrative arc, a great city, a great war, a great fall. Archaeology, however, produced something more fragmented and less narratively satisfying, but far more historically realistic. It revealed a place shaped by time rather than a single event. As later researchers refined the chronology, Troy became less a symbol of one legendary moment and more a case study in long-term settlement dynamics. Its history reflects how geography, economy, environment, and human decision-making interact over centuries. The site becomes less about answering whether the Trojan War happened exactly as described, and more about understanding why such stories emerge in the first place. Even the notion of Priam's city shifts under this perspective. Instead of pointing to a single archaeological layer, it becomes a cultural construct that compresses multiple phases of occupation into one narrative identity. The real Troy resists that compression. It exists in layers that do not align neatly with story, but instead reveal a far more gradual and complex evolution. By the end of Schliemann's legacy and the beginning of modern archaeological method, Troy had already transformed again. It was no longer just a mythic site or a treasure field. It had become a layered record of human persistence in a strategically significant location, shaped by forces that no single narrative can fully capture. And beneath all interpretations, mythic, historical, or archaeological, the hill remains unchanged, continuing to hold within it the accumulated memory of civilizations that rose, adapted, and eventually vanished into the same ground. The gold that Schliemann lifted from the soil of Isarlik did not simply change public understanding of Troy. It also changed the way the ancient world was imagined. Newspapers across Europe and beyond carried images of glittering objects, framing them as proof that the Homeric epics were not just literature, but memory preserved in metal. Yet beneath the excitement, A quieter truth was already emerging in scholarly circles. The objects were real, but their story was far older, more layered, and far less aligned with a single heroic narrative than anyone had hoped. The so-called Priam's treasure became an instant cultural sensation. Jewellery, diadems, cups, and weapons were interpreted through the lens of wealth and kingship described in epic poetry. But the archaeological context told a different story. These objects belonged to Troy too, a phase separated by centuries from the late Bronze Age world traditionally associated with the Trojan War. In other words, the treasure was not evidence of Homer's city. It was evidence of a much earlier Troy, one that already understood wealth, craft, and hierarchy long before epic poetry ever existed. This misalignment did not diminish the importance of the find. Instead, it revealed something more fundamental about how humans interpret the past. When confronted with extraordinary material evidence, the mind naturally seeks narrative alignment. Schliemann's interpretation was not unusual for his time. It reflected a broader 19th century desire to merge classical literature with physical discovery. But archaeology would gradually move away from this approach, toward a stricter separation between evidence and expectation. As excavation continued after Schliemann, a more disciplined methodology emerged. Wilhelm Dörpfeld and later Carl Blegen refined the stratigraphic understanding of the site, carefully distinguishing between occupational phases. Their work revealed that Troy is not defined by one moment of wealth or destruction, but by a long sequence of structural changes, each reflecting different historical conditions. This shift in methodology transformed Troy from a symbolic target into a complex archaeological record. One of the most striking revelations was just how different each Troy actually was. Troy 1 and 2 were relatively small fortified settlements with dense domestic structures and strong defensive walls. Troy 6, by contrast, expanded into a more architecturally sophisticated urban centre with massive stone fortifications and evidence of organised planning. Troy 7 shows signs of compression and stress, with more crowded living conditions and irregular construction patterns. Each phase reflects a different social reality, not a continuous version of the same city. Within Troy 6, the scale of construction is particularly impressive. The walls are not only large but engineered with precision, featuring sloped foundations that increase stability. These fortifications suggest not just defence against human enemies, but awareness of seismic risks. The builders understood that stability in this region required more than military strength. It required adaptation to environmental conditions as well. This dual awareness of human and natural threat defines much of Troy's architectural evolution. Inside the walls, evidence of structured urban life becomes more visible. Streets appear more organised than in earlier phases, and domestic areas show signs of standardised building techniques. Storage facilities indicate centralised management of goods, suggesting administrative oversight. Imported pottery from Mycenaean Greece and other regions appears alongside local Anatolian styles, indicating sustained engagement with long-distance trade networks. This phase of Troy likely represents its peak in terms of regional importance. It is not a palace civilization on the scale of Mycenae or Hattusa, but it is clearly integrated into the broader late Bronze Age system of exchange. Goods, people, and ideas moved through the city in significant quantities, reinforcing its role as a node in a much larger network. Its wealth, therefore, was not isolated accumulation, but distributed interaction. Yet even at its height, Troy remains structurally vulnerable. The same geography that enabled prosperity also exposed it to shifting external pressures. Trade routes could be disrupted. Political alliances elsewhere could alter regional stability. Environmental fluctuations could affect agricultural output. In such a system, stability is always conditional, never absolute. This conditional stability becomes more visible in Troy 7, where signs of stress increase. Houses appear more tightly packed, suggesting population pressure within the defensive perimeter. Storage systems show signs of strain, possibly indicating supply challenges. Some buildings are hastily constructed or modified, suggesting rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. These are not signs of sudden collapse, but of gradual compression under external or internal pressure. It is within this layer that archaeologists find the most debated evidence of destruction. Burned structures, collapsed walls, and scattered remains suggest a disruptive event. However, the scale and pattern of damage do not point clearly to a single cause. Some areas appear heavily affected, while others remain intact enough to suggest partial continuity. This uneven distribution complicates any simple explanation. Earthquakes remain a strong candidate for at least part of this destruction. The region's seismic activity is well documented, and structural damage patterns in some areas are consistent with ground movement. However, other indicators, such as weapon fragments and defensive positioning, suggest that human conflict may also have played a role. It is possible that multiple factors overlapped, with environmental instability and human violence reinforcing each other. What is particularly significant about Troy 7 is that it does not end in silence. The site is not abandoned completely. Instead, it transitions into reduced but continuing occupation. New structures are built, often reusing materials from earlier phases. The city contracts but does not disappear. This continuity challenges any interpretation of a singular catastrophic end. Across the broader late Bronze Age world, similar patterns appear in other regions. Many palace-centered societies experience disruption, reduced administrative control, and shifts in population distribution. Trade networks weaken or reorganize. Some cities decline, while others adapt or relocate. Troy fits within this broader pattern of transformation, rather than standing apart from it. However, caution is necessary when drawing direct parallels. While Troy shares timing and general characteristics with regional changes, it is not clearly linked to any single collapse mechanism. The so-called Bronze Age collapse is not a single event, but a prolonged period of restructuring across multiple regions. Troy's experience is one thread within that larger and more complex tapestry. One of the enduring challenges in interpreting Troy is the ambiguity of destruction evidence. Fire can result from warfare, accident, or environmental conditions. Collapsed architecture can result from siege activity or seismic activity. Abandoned structures can indicate displacement, migration, or gradual decline. Without written records from the site itself, each layer requires careful interpretation based on indirect clues. This ambiguity is not a weakness of archaeology. It is a reflection of the complexity of ancient life. Human events rarely leave clean signatures. Instead, they overlap, accumulate, and interfere with one another. At Troy, this complexity is preserved in exceptional detail, precisely because the site was occupied repeatedly over long periods. The legacy of Schliemann, often criticised for its methodological flaws, nevertheless played a crucial role in bringing this complexity to light. His work revealed that beneath the myth of a single city lies a much deeper reality, a place continuously rebuilt by successive generations. Later archaeologists corrected his interpretations, but they built upon his discovery of the site's true depth. As understanding improved, Troy shifted from being a target of mythological confirmation to a laboratory for studying long-term settlement dynamics. Its significance no longer depended on proving Homer correct or incorrect. Instead, it became a case study in how geography, economy, environment, and human adaptation interact over centuries. Even the idea of wealthy Troy changes under this perspective. Wealth is no longer a fixed attribute of a single city, but a recurring condition tied to specific phases of occupation. Some layers show prosperity, others show decline. Some periods are well connected, others more isolated. The site's identity is therefore not static, but cyclical and responsive. By the time classical Greek writers reflected on Troy, much of this complexity had already been compressed into symbolic form. The city became a reference point for themes of endurance, loss, and the consequences of conflict. Its physical reality was partially preserved, but its historical nuance was transformed into narrative meaning. And yet, despite all reinterpretations, the hill itself remains unchanged. Beneath layers of soil, stone, and time, Troy continues to exist not as a single story, but as a dense archive of human occupation. Each layer adds depth without erasing what came before, and in that accumulation, the city becomes something larger than myth or history alone. It becomes a record of how civilizations build, adapt, and leave traces behind even when their names are forgotten or transformed into legend. Inside the layered remains of Troy, silence is deceptive. It suggests emptiness. But what actually survives beneath the soil is a dense imprint of daily life, preserved not as narrative but as residue. Broken pottery, post holes of long-vanished buildings, ash from hearths, fragments of tools worn down by repeated use. These are not dramatic objects on their own. Yet together, they reconstruct something far more intimate than myth. The rhythm of ordinary existence inside a city that would later be remembered as legendary. Life in Troy was not defined by singular heroic moments, but by repetition. Food prepared and stored, walls repaired after weather damage, goods exchanged between households, animals raised and slaughtered, children growing up in the shadow of fortifications that most residents likely viewed not as symbols of epic warfare, but as practical protection against uncertain regional conditions. The archaeological record, when read closely, reveals a city structured around continuity rather than spectacle. Domestic architecture across multiple phases suggests a society organised around extended households rather than isolated nuclear units. Houses vary in size, but many share similar structural principles: central courtyards, storage areas, and hearth spaces. These features indicate that daily life was centred on shared labour and communal activity. Cooking, weaving, and food processing were not private acts but coordinated household functions. The house was not just a shelter, but an economic unit. Among the most revealing materials are storage vessels. Large jars embedded in floors or placed along walls suggest long-term planning and surplus management. Grain, oil, and possibly fermented goods were stored in quantities that exceed immediate household consumption. This implies not only agricultural production but also systems of distribution and control. Someone, or some structure within the society, was responsible for managing resources beyond the scale of individual families. Craft production also leaves a strong imprint in the archaeological layers. Evidence of metalworking appears in the form of slag, moulds, and unfinished objects. This suggests that bronze production was not incidental, but organised within the settlement. The presence of standardised tools across different layers indicates continuity in craft traditions. Even as political or environmental conditions changed, craft specialists likely held an important role in the urban economy, contributing to both local use and external exchange. Textiles, although rarely preserved directly, are inferred through spindle whirls and loom weights. These small objects reveal a major aspect of household production, often overlooked in narratives focused on warfare or elite power. Textile production was likely one of the most consistent economic activities in the city, involving large portions of the population, particularly women. Cloth was not only used locally, but also likely served as a tradable commodity within regional networks. Trade is visible in the diversity of materials found across different settlement phases. Pottery styles show influences from the Aegean, Anatolia, and possibly more distant regions. Metal composition suggests access to multiple ore sources. Even the design of certain household items reflects shared technological traditions across the late Bronze Age world. Troy was not isolated. It was part of a web of exchange that connected communities across land and sea. Yet this connectivity was not evenly distributed. Some households appear to have had greater access to imported goods, while others relied more heavily on local materials. This suggests social stratification within the city. Wealth and access were likely uneven, though not necessarily rigidly fixed. The archaeological record does not reveal named individuals or dynasties with clarity, but it does suggest differences in consumption patterns that reflect varying levels of status. Food remains provide another layer of insight into daily life. Animal bones show a mixture of livestock consumption, including cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. The presence of fish remains in some layers indicates access to coastal or riverine resources. Plant remains, where preserved, suggest cultivation of cereals and legumes. Diet appears to have been diverse but shaped by seasonal availability and storage capacity. There is no indication of extreme scarcity in most phases. Though later layers suggest increasing pressure on resources, one of the more subtle findings is the repetition of architectural layouts across different phases. Even after destruction events, rebuilt structures often follow similar spatial patterns. This suggests that urban memory was preserved not through written plans, but through inherited knowledge of space. People rebuilding the city likely followed traditions of construction passed down through generations, maintaining continuity even as physical structures were destroyed. At the same time, there is evidence of gradual change in urban organisation. In earlier phases, settlement density appears lower, with more open space between structures. In later phases, particularly Troy 7, buildings become more tightly packed. This shift may reflect population pressure, reduced available land within fortifications, or changes in social organisation. The city becomes more compressed, less open, more constrained by its defensive boundaries. Religious or ritual activity is more difficult to identify with certainty, but certain features suggest its presence. Small figurines, altars, and structured deposits of objects appear in various layers. These finds do not point to a single unified religious system, but rather to localised practices embedded within domestic and communal spaces. Ritual life, like economic life, appears integrated into daily routines rather than separated into distinct institutional structures. What is notably absent from the archaeological record is any clear evidence of centralised monumental architecture comparable to the large palatial complexes found in other late Bronze Age centres, such as Mycenae or Hattusa. This absence suggests that Troy, despite its strategic importance, may not have functioned as a fully centralised palace state. Instead, it likely operated as a regional hub with a more distributed form of authority. This distinction is important for understanding how the city functioned politically. Without strong evidence for a single dominant palace system, it is possible that Troy's governance relied on a combination of local elites, merchant groups, and external alliances. Authority may have been negotiated rather than strictly imposed. Such systems are more flexible, but also more vulnerable to disruption. As one moves through the layers of occupation, continuity and disruption appear side by side. Some traditions persist across centuries, while others change abruptly. Construction methods evolve, material preferences shift. Settlement density increases or decreases depending on broader regional conditions. The city is never static. It is constantly adjusting to internal and external pressures. Even destruction events, often emphasized in discussions of Troy, do not erase daily life completely. In many cases, rebuilding begins soon after damage occurs. Structures are repaired, reused, or replaced. Objects are recovered and reintegrated into new contexts. The archaeological record shows not only collapse, but recovery. This cycle repeats multiple times, creating a pattern of resilience that defines the site as much as any single event. It is this resilience that complicates simplistic narratives of Troy as a city doomed by fate or destroyed in a single catastrophic war. Instead, what emerges is a long-term settlement that repeatedly negotiates survival under changing conditions. Sometimes those conditions are stable, sometimes unstable, but the response is consistently adaptive. Within this framework, the people of Troy appear less like participants in a single legendary conflict and more like inhabitants of a long-lived urban environment shaped by geography, trade, and environmental uncertainty. Their lives were likely defined by maintenance rather than heroism, by repair rather than conquest, by continuity rather than rupture. And yet, it is precisely this ordinary continuity that makes the site so extraordinary in hindsight, because over time, these accumulated lives, layered one upon another, became the foundation for one of the most enduring stories in human history. A story that would transform everyday existence into epic memory, and a densely inhabited hill into a symbol of civilization itself. The wealth of Troy did not emerge from isolation, nor from conquest alone, but from something far more persistent and less visible in heroic narrative circulation. Goods, people, and ideas moved through the region in continuous streams, and Troy existed precisely at the point where those streams narrowed and concentrated. It was not a source of wealth in itself, but a filter through which wealth had to pass. The Dardanelles, the narrow maritime passage just beyond the settlement, functioned as a natural bottleneck between the Aegean and the Black Sea regions. Even in antiquity, this corridor represented one of the most efficient routes connecting inland Anatolia with maritime trade networks extending toward the Mediterranean world. Ships carrying metals, textiles, ceramics, and luxury goods could not avoid this passage. Land routes feeding into it were equally constrained by geography. Any settlement positioned near this junction had the potential to influence the entire flow of regional exchange. Troy's advantage lay not in direct control of the strait itself, but in its proximity to the approaches leading to it. From the hill of Hisarlik, movement across the surrounding plains could be observed and, to some extent, regulated. Caravans moving between inland Anatolia and coastal ports would have passed within its sphere of awareness. Maritime activity near the entrance of the strait would have been indirectly visible and politically relevant in such a landscape. Even partial influence over movement translated into economic opportunity. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that Troy participated actively in long-distance exchange networks. Imported ceramics appear across multiple settlement layers, particularly those associated with the late Bronze Age phases. These objects are not isolated curiosities but part of broader material patterns that connect Troy to the Aegean world and beyond. Similarly, locally produced pottery shows stylistic influences that suggest interaction rather than isolation. Metal artifacts provide further insight into these connections. Bronze production requires copper and tin, neither of which are evenly distributed across the immediate region. The presence of finished bronze objects, as well as production debris such as slag and moulds, indicates that Troy was integrated into supply chains that extended well beyond its immediate surroundings. These networks likely included both overland and maritime routes. Linking the city to resource zones across Anatolia and possibly farther afield, the structure of this trade was not necessarily centralized or uniform. Instead, it likely operated through a combination of formal and informal mechanisms. Goods may have been exchanged through itinerant merchants, regional intermediaries, or diplomatic relationships between settlements. In such a system, control over a key junction like Troy did not mean monopolizing trade, but influencing its flow through taxation, negotiation, or selective access. Storage architecture within the settlement reflects this economic role. Large pithoi embedded in floors and dedicated storage rooms suggest the accumulation and management of surplus goods. These facilities indicate that Troy was capable of holding resources beyond immediate consumption needs, a key characteristic of settlements involved in redistribution or redistribution-adjacent economies. Surplus management is often a sign of both prosperity and strategic planning. However, wealth derived from circulation is inherently unstable. Unlike agricultural surplus tied to local production, trade-based wealth depends on external conditions that cannot be fully controlled. Shifts in regional politics, disruptions in maritime routes, or instability in neighbouring regions could rapidly affect the flow of goods. Troy's prosperity, therefore, was always contingent rather than guaranteed. This contingency is reflected in the archaeological record through periods of fluctuation. Some layers show increased density of imported goods and architectural expansion, while others indicate contraction and simplified material culture. These shifts do not follow a simple linear trajectory of rise and fall, but rather suggest responsiveness to broader regional dynamics. Troy's economy expands when networks are stable and contracts when they are disrupted. One of the more subtle indicators of economic integration is the standardization of certain craft products. Pottery forms, in particular, show recurring shapes and manufacturing techniques across different phases. This suggests shared technological knowledge and possibly coordinated production standards across regions. Such standardization is often associated with sustained interaction between communities rather than isolated development. At the same time, local variation persists. Not all objects conform to external styles, and regional characteristics remain visible in many artifacts. This balance between standardization and local identity reflects a system in which Troy participated in broader networks without losing its internal distinctiveness. It was integrated, but not absorbed. Animal remains also provide indirect evidence of economic structure. The composition of livestock suggests not only subsistence, but also surplus production. Herding practices would have supported both local consumption and external trade in secondary products such as wool, hides, and possibly dairy. These goods are less visible in the archaeological record, but are critical components of ancient exchange systems. The role of Troy within these systems may have been less about production and more about mediation. Settlements positioned at geographic junctions often function as intermediaries, facilitating exchange between regions with different resources and needs. In such a role, value is created not only through goods themselves, but through their movement. Control of passage becomes economically significant. This mediating function helps explain why Troy repeatedly attracted settlement despite environmental and political instability. Even when individual phases were destroyed or abandoned, the underlying geographic advantage remained unchanged. New populations returning to the site would have inherited not only ruins but also strategic awareness of its potential. Trade, however, is not only economic, it is also social and cultural. The movement of goods carries with it ideas, technologies, and practices. The presence of diverse material styles within Troy suggests exposure to multiple cultural influences. This does not imply cultural uniformity, but rather a dynamic environment in which external elements were selectively adopted and adapted. Religious and symbolic objects found within the settlement also reflect this interaction. Figurines and ritual items show both continuity with local traditions an occasional incorporation of broader stylistic elements. This suggests that cultural exchange accompanied economic exchange, reinforcing Troy's position as a node of interaction rather than a closed system. Despite this connectivity, there is no clear evidence that Troy functioned as a dominant imperial centre controlling large territories. Unlike some contemporary late Bronze Age states, it does not appear to have exerted extensive administrative control over distant regions. Its influence seems more localised and relational, based on position and access rather than territorial expansion. This distinction is important for understanding its vulnerabilities. Settlements that rely on territorial control can absorb shocks differently than those dependent on trade mediation. When external networks shift, a mediating centre like Troy may experience rapid changes in fortune. Its strength is also its sensitivity. In periods of regional stability, this sensitivity translates into prosperity. In periods of disruption, it becomes a liability. Archaeological layers suggest that Troy experienced both conditions multiple times throughout its history. Expansion phases correspond with increased trade activity, while contraction phases align with signs of stress and rebuilding. Even within these fluctuations, the settlement demonstrates remarkable persistence. Economic systems adjust, architectural strategies shift, and population density changes, but the site remains occupied across centuries. This persistence suggests that the advantages of location consistently outweighed the risks of instability. Over time, this economic reality becomes intertwined with cultural memory. A place that consistently attracts wealth, trade, and attention also becomes a place that accumulates stories. By the time later traditions begin to form, Troy is no longer just a settlement within a trade network. It becomes a symbol of value, conflict, and desirability. That symbolic transformation, however, is built on a very concrete foundation, a hill positioned at the intersection of movement. Long before epic narratives shaped its identity, Troy functioned as a practical response to geography. Its wealth was not mythical, it was logistical, and beneath the layers of storytelling that would later surround it. That logistical reality remains visible in the soil fragments of goods that travelled far, systems of storage that managed surplus, and structures that adapted repeatedly to the demands of circulation in a world defined by movement. At some point in Troy's long sequence of occupations, the rhythm of rebuilding begins to show a different kind of pattern, not the steady adaptation of a prosperous trading centre, and not the orderly expansion of a stable settlement, but something more uneven, as if the city is repeatedly interrupted mid-course. Walls are repaired before they are fully understood. Houses are constructed over debris that still carries traces of fire. Entire sections of the settlement appear to compress inward, as though the city is shrinking under pressure it cannot fully explain. It is within these layers that archaeologists encounter the most striking and contested evidence destruction deposits, marked by burning, collapse, and abandonment. These are the layers that most strongly evoke the image of a city under attack, yet they also resist any single interpretation. Fire is present, but its origin is unclear. Structures fall, but not always in patterns consistent with siege warfare. Objects are left behind, but sometimes in ways that suggest rapid departure, and other times gradual decline. Troy 7, in particular, becomes the focal point of this ambiguity. Unlike earlier phases characterized by expansion and architectural ambition, this period shows signs of internal pressure. Houses are built closer together, sometimes encroaching on earlier open spaces. Storage areas appear strained, with less uniform organization. Streets narrow or become irregular. The overall impression is of a settlement adapting to constraint rather than growth. Within this compressed urban environment, archaeologists find evidence of destruction that includes ash layers, charred wood, and collapsed masonry. In some areas, human remains are discovered in contexts that suggest sudden disruption. Yet even here, the distribution is inconsistent. Some buildings are heavily affected, while neighbouring structures remain relatively intact. This unevenness complicates any straightforward narrative of a single catastrophic event. One of the most persistent interpretive challenges is distinguishing between destruction caused by human conflict and that caused by natural forces. Earthquakes are a particularly strong candidate in this region, given its known seismic activity. Structural collapse patterns in certain layers are consistent with ground movement, where buildings fail inward without clear signs of burning or combat. However, other layers show indications that are more difficult to reconcile with purely natural causes. Weapon fragments appear in some destruction contexts, including arrowheads and spear points. These objects suggest the possibility of armed conflict, but they do not by themselves confirm the scale or nature of that conflict. Weapons can accumulate over time, and their presence does not necessarily indicate large-scale warfare. Similarly, burn layers can result from accidental fires or localized destruction rather than organized attack. This overlap of possible causes creates what scholars often describe as a multi-causal signature. In practical terms, this means that no single explanation fully accounts for the observed evidence. Instead, different forces may have acted at different times or even in combination. An earthquake could weaken structures, followed by fire spreading through damaged areas, or internal conflict could occur within a settlement already stressed by environmental instability. What makes Troy particularly difficult to interpret is that these destruction layers are not isolated events. They occur multiple times across different phases. This repetition suggests that instability is not an anomaly in Troy's history, but a recurring condition. The city is not destroyed once and rebuilt once. It is affected repeatedly, each time responding in different ways depending on the broader context. In Troy 7, there is also evidence suggesting population pressure within the fortified area. Houses become denser, and construction quality becomes more variable. This pattern is often associated with the movement of people into defensible spaces during periods of external uncertainty. Whether this reflects migration due to conflict elsewhere, environmental stress, or regional instability remains unresolved. But the effect on the settlement is visible compression of space and resources. Storage systems in this phase also appear less stable. While earlier layers show more standardized and organized storage practices, later contexts suggest a breakdown or adaptation of these systems. Containers are reused in less structured ways, and storage areas appear more improvised. This may indicate disruptions in supply chains or changes in economic organization under pressure. The presence of fire in multiple contexts remains one of the most visually compelling aspects of these layers. Burned walls, ash deposits, and carbonized materials create a strong impression of sudden destruction. However, fire in archaeological contexts is notoriously difficult to interpret. It can result from warfare, but also from domestic accidents, industrial activity, or secondary burning after structural collapse. In some areas of Troy 7, the pattern of burning appears localized rather than widespread. This suggests that if conflict occurred, it may not have affected the entire settlement uniformly. Instead, certain districts may have been more exposed than others, or destruction may have occurred in stages rather than all at once. This further complicates any attempt to reconstruct a single coherent narrative of fall. Despite these signs of disruption, the archaeological record also shows continuity. After destruction events, rebuilding occurs again. New structures are placed over older foundations. Materials from collapsed buildings are reused in new construction. Even in reduced form, the settlement persists. This resilience is a critical aspect of Troy's long-term history, often overshadowed by the focus on destruction. The question of what caused these repeated disruptions has generated multiple competing interpretations. Earthquake activity remains one of the strongest candidates for at least some phases, given geological evidence from the region. The possibility of regional conflict, possibly involving shifting power dynamics in the Late Bronze Age, also remains plausible. Environmental stress, including changes in resource availability, may have contributed as well. What is increasingly clear, however, is that no single factor can explain all observed destruction layers. Instead, Troy appears to have experienced a combination of pressures that varied over time. In some phases, environmental and structural vulnerability may have played a larger role. In others, human conflict or regional instability may have been more significant. The archaeological record preserves the effects, but not always the precise causes. This complexity reflects a broader reality of ancient urban life. Cities in strategic locations are often exposed to multiple overlapping risks. Economic importance brings wealth, but also attention. Geographic advantage brings opportunity, but also vulnerability. Troy's position at a critical junction of movement meant that it was never insulated from external forces. As the settlement transitions out of its major Bronze Age phases, the pattern of occupation changes again. The city does not vanish, but it diminishes in scale and influence. Later phases show simpler architectural forms and reduced urban complexity, yet the continuity of occupation remains, indicating that the site retains significance even after its peak. Over time, memory begins to reshape these earlier destruction layers. What were once complex, multi-causal events become simplified in cultural transmission. Later traditions tend to compress repeated disruptions into singular moments of dramatic fall. This process is not unique to Troy, but it is particularly visible here due to the later literary tradition that would eventually dominate its interpretation. The archaeological reality, however, remains resistant to such compression. Each layer preserves its own combination of evidence, often incomplete and ambiguous. Fire, collapse, abandonment, and rebuilding coexist in patterns that do not resolve neatly into a single story. Instead, they suggest a long history of repeated stress and adaptation. In this sense, Troy is not defined by one destruction event, but by a sequence of them. Each one contributes to the gradual transformation of the settlement, shaping its architecture, population, and role within the region. The city does not end abruptly. It changes incrementally through cycles of disruption and recovery. And beneath all of these layers, the hill continues to hold its accumulated record. Not a single moment of collapse, but a series of interruptions that, when viewed together, form a deeper pattern, a settlement constantly negotiating its survival in a landscape where stability is never permanent. The question of how Troy fell is less a single problem than a cluster of overlapping uncertainties that resist reduction to any one explanation. As archaeologists move deeper into the layers traditionally associated with its final Bronze Age phases, the evidence begins to fragment rather than converge. Burn marks appear beside structurally collapsed walls. Storage vessels remain intact in some rooms while neighbouring spaces show sudden abandonment. Human remains are present, but not in quantities that clearly indicate a large-scale massacre or prolonged siege. The result is a landscape of partial signals rather than a unified narrative. Earthquakes stand among the strongest candidates for at least part of this disruption. The geology of northwestern Anatolia is shaped by active fault systems, and seismic events are well documented both in antiquity and in the modern era. In archaeological layers corresponding to Troy 6 and 7, certain structural failures appear consistent with ground movement. Walls that collapse inward without widespread burning, foundations that shift unevenly. and buildings that show stress fractures all point towards seismic influence as a plausible factor. However, earthquakes alone do not fully account for the pattern of destruction observed across all layers. In some contexts, fire is clearly present in ways that suggest more than accidental ignition. Charred beams, burned storage areas, and localized ash deposits indicate that combustion played a role in at least some episodes of destruction. Yet even here, the distribution is uneven, and the scale varies significantly from one part of the settlement to another. This inconsistency makes it difficult to attribute a single catastrophic fire to the entire city. Human conflict remains another possibility, particularly in the later phases associated with Troy 7. The presence of weapon fragments, including arrowheads and spear points, suggests that violence occurred within or near the settlement. Some architectural features, such as reinforced gateways and denser internal layouts, may reflect defensive responses to external pressure. Yet there is no clear archaeological signature of a prolonged siege comparable to those described in later literary tradition. One of the central difficulties in interpreting these layers is that the physical evidence does not preserve intent. Archaeology can reveal that a wall fell, that fire occurred, or that objects were left behind in haste, but it cannot directly reveal whether these events were caused by invasion, internal conflict, environmental disaster, or a combination of factors. As a result, multiple interpretations remain viable, each supported by different subsets of evidence. In recent scholarship, the idea of multi-causal destruction has gained increasing acceptance. Rather than seeking a single explanatory event, researchers now often consider sequences of stresses. A seismic event may weaken infrastructure, making buildings more vulnerable. A disrupted supply system may strain food storage and population density. In such conditions, even minor conflicts or accidents could escalate into larger episodes of destruction. The archaeological record at Troy is consistent with such layered processes. Troy 7 is particularly important in this regard because it reflects a settlement under visible strain before its final disruptions. The compression of living space, irregular construction patterns, and increased density within the fortifications suggest a population adapting to constrained conditions. These changes are not necessarily signs of imminent collapse, but they indicate reduced stability. In such an environment, vulnerability increases even without a single triggering catastrophe. Another interpretive challenge lies in the unevenness of destruction. Some areas within the same phase show severe damage, while others remain relatively intact. This pattern is difficult to reconcile with a single large-scale event affecting the entire settlement uniformly. Instead, it suggests either localized incidents or staggered episodes of disruption over time. Such patterns are more consistent with repeated stress than with one decisive moment of destruction. The absence of clear evidence for a unified destruction event does not mean that violence or catastrophe did not occur. Rather, it indicates that if such events happened, they were embedded within longer processes of change. A settlement like Troy, situated at a strategic junction and exposed to multiple external pressures, would have been particularly susceptible to cascading effects. Small disruptions could accumulate into larger structural failures over time. Environmental factors may also have contributed indirectly to instability. Changes in climate patterns during the Late Bronze Age have been documented across the broader eastern Mediterranean region. Periods of reduced rainfall or agricultural stress could have affected food production and trade reliability. While the specific impact on Troy remains difficult to isolate, such conditions would have added pressure to an already dynamic system. When these factors are considered together, a more complex picture emerges. Troy does not appear to have fallen in a single, dramatic moment. Instead, it seems to have undergone a series of disruptions, each influenced by a combination of environmental, structural, and possibly human factors. Some of these disruptions may have been severe enough to cause temporary abandonment or significant population shifts. Others may have resulted in localized destruction followed by rebuilding. This pattern is not unique to Troy, but it is particularly visible here due to the depth and continuity of the archaeological record. Few ancient sites preserve such a long sequence of occupation layers in the same location. This continuity allows for a rare long-term view of how settlements respond to repeated stress, adaptation, and recovery. One of the most important insights from these layers is that destruction and continuity are not mutually exclusive. Even after significant damage, rebuilding occurs. New structures are erected over old foundations. Materials are reused. Spatial organization is adjusted rather than completely redesigned. This suggests that the settlement was not simply erased and restarted, but continuously reinterpreted by its inhabitants. The idea of a single fall of Troy therefore becomes increasingly difficult to sustain in purely archaeological terms. Instead, what appears in the record is a gradual transformation of the settlement structure, population density, and regional role. Over time, its prominence declines, but occupation continues in altered forms. The site evolves rather than disappears. This has important implications for how later historical and literary traditions understood Troy. When later cultures encountered the ruins or remembered fragments of its past, they were not engaging with a single moment frozen in time, but with a long history already compressed by memory. Repeated disruptions may have been simplified into a singular narrative of destruction, because such narratives are easier to transmit and preserve. In this sense, the idea of a Trojan fall may reflect not just historical events, but the structure of human storytelling itself. Complex sequences of change are often condensed into defining moments, especially when transmitted orally over long periods. What archaeology reveals is the process behind that condensation in multiple events, layered over time, gradually transformed into a unified cultural memory. Even within the archaeological data, there are hints of this compression. Later layers sometimes reuse earlier architectural features, creating visual continuity across disrupted phases. To a later observer, such continuity might obscure the boundaries between distinct events, reinforcing the impression of a single historical trajectory rather than a series of interruptions. Ultimately, the destruction of Troy cannot be reduced to a single cause or moment. It is better understood as a process distributed across time, shaped by interacting forces that include geology, economy, human conflict, and environmental variability. Each factor contributes partially, but none provides a complete explanation on its own. And so the city's fall, as it is often described, becomes something more complex, not an ending, but a transition shaped by repeated stress, adaptation, and partial recovery. The archaeological record does not preserve a final scene of destruction. It preserves a long sequence of instability gradually giving way to transformation. Beneath the surface, Troy does not end where stories later place its conclusion. It continues to shift, layer upon layer, until its identity changes into something smaller, quieter, and more fragmented than the city that once stood at the crossroads of worlds. By the time Troy's later Bronze Age layers give way to the early Iron Age, the wider world around it is no longer the same system it once was. The interconnected network of palace economies, long-distance trade routes, and tightly managed regional powers across the eastern Mediterranean begins to fracture. It is not a single collapse, but a long unravelling, and Troy finds itself living through the consequences of that slow disintegration. The city that once stood at a critical junction of exchange now exists in a landscape where the currents of movement have become less predictable, more fragmented, and in many cases, reduced in scale. This broader transformation is often referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, though the term itself can be misleading. It suggests a sudden event, when in reality the archaeological record across multiple regions points to a prolonged period of instability. Palatial centres in places like Mycenaean Greece, parts of Anatolia, and the Levant show signs of abandonment, destruction, or administrative breakdown over several generations. Writing systems disappear or fall out of use in some areas. Trade networks weaken or reroute. Populations shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes in waves. Troy does not sit outside this process. Instead, it reflects it in a localised form. The later phases of the settlement, particularly those transitioning out of Troy 7, show reduced architectural complexity and signs of altered urban organisation. The scale of construction diminishes, and the density of material culture changes. This does not indicate immediate abandonment, but rather a recalibration of the settlement's role within a shrinking or reorganising regional system. One of the key features of this transitional period is the fragmentation of exchange networks. Where earlier layers show clear evidence of long-distance trade, later contexts suggest more limited or regionally focused interaction. Imported goods become less frequent, and local production takes on a more dominant role. This shift is not unique to Troy, but part of a wider pattern observed across multiple sites during this period of transformation. The reasons behind this systemic change remain debated. Some scholars emphasise environmental factors, including climatic fluctuations that may have affected agricultural productivity across large regions. Others point to internal political instability within palace-based economies, where centralised systems may have become vulnerable to disruption. Still others highlight the role of migration and population movement, as groups displaced by instability elsewhere moved into new territories, altering existing social and economic structures. What is clear from the archaeological record is that stability in the late Bronze Age world was highly interconnected. When one part of the system failed or weakened, the effects could propagate across long distances. Troy, positioned at a geographic intersection of routes, would have been particularly sensitive to such shifts, even if it did not directly experience the collapse of palace centres elsewhere. It would have felt the consequences through reduced trade, altered alliances, and changing patterns of movement. Within Troy itself, the material evidence suggests adaptation rather than immediate breakdown. Architecture becomes simpler, but not absent. Domestic structures continue to be built, though with less uniformity and reduced scale. Storage practices persist, though often in more modest forms. The settlement continues to function, but under different conditions than those of its earlier peak. This continuity is important. It challenges any assumption that the late Bronze Age collapse produced uniform abandonment across all regions. Instead, it appears to have generated a spectrum of responses. Some sites were fully abandoned, others significantly reduced, and still others transformed into new forms of settlement organisation. Troy belongs to the latter category, a place that persists, but changes in character. As external networks contract, local relationships become more important. Communities increasingly rely on regional resources rather than long-distance imports. This shift can be seen in the archaeological record through changes in material composition and production techniques. Local styles become more prominent, while external influences diminish. This does not indicate isolation, but reorientation. In this context, the later phases of Troy may represent a more self-contained settlement structure. Rather than acting as a major node in an expansive trade network, it functions within a more limited regional framework. Its strategic location remains significant, but the scale of interaction is reduced. The city's identity shifts from being a major intermediary hub to a more localised centre of activity. At the same time, The memory of earlier phases does not disappear entirely. Material reused within the site suggests that older structures remained visible and accessible for extended periods. New buildings constructed over earlier foundations create a physical layering that preserves traces of past occupation. In a sense, the city's history remains embedded within its own fabric, even as its social and economic functions change. This layering of continuity and change is one of the defining features of Troy's long-term development. Even during periods of contraction, the site does not erase its past. Instead, it incorporates it. Walls are rebuilt along older lines, materials are reused, spatial organisation retains echoes of earlier layouts. The result is a settlement that evolves through accumulation rather than replacement. Outside Troy, similar patterns appear across the wider region. Formerly centralised systems give way to more localised forms of organisation. Smaller communities become more prominent. Regional identities shift. In some cases, new cultural forms emerge that blend older traditions with new influences. The result is not uniform decline, but transformation into a different kind of social landscape. Troy's position within this shifting world remains ambiguous. It is no longer clearly a dominant centre, but neither is it entirely marginal. Its strategic geography continues to matter, but the scale of systems passing through it has changed. It exists in a reduced but persistent form, adapting to a new balance of regional dynamics. One of the most significant aspects of this transition is the loss of large-scale administrative systems that characterized earlier palace economies. Without centralized record-keeping and redistribution systems, economic activity becomes more locally managed. This does not necessarily imply disorder, but rather a shift in organizational scale. Archaeology reflects this through the absence of certain standardized administrative artifacts that are common in earlier Bronze Age contexts. In place of these systems, more flexible and decentralized forms of organization appear. Households and small groups likely play a larger role in production and distribution. This shift may have increased resilience in some respects, while reducing the capacity for large-scale coordination. The archaeological record captures this balance indirectly, through changes in material distribution and settlement structure. Despite these changes, there is no indication that the region becomes empty or inactive. Human occupation continues, though in altered forms. The intensity of interaction decreases in some areas, while persisting in others. Troy remains part of this evolving landscape, not as a dominant power, but as a continuing point of habitation within a transformed world. The idea of collapse, when applied to this period, must therefore be understood carefully. It does not describe a uniform or total disappearance of civilization, but rather a reorganization of social, economic, and political structures. In some places, this reorganization is dramatic. In others, it is gradual. Troy reflects the latter, a site that adjusts to changing conditions over time. As the Bronze Age gives way to the Iron Age, the material signature of Troy becomes simpler, but not absent. The settlement continues, though with reduced complexity. New cultural influences appear, while older ones fade or transform. The city does not vanish from the archaeological record, it transitions into a different phase of existence. And within this transition lies an important insight. Troy's history is not defined solely by its moments of height or its episodes of destruction, but by its ability to persist through systemic change. Even as the world around it reorganizes, the site remains occupied, reinterpreted, and reused. This continuity across disruption is what ultimately links Troy to the broader patterns of ancient history. It is not an isolated case of rise and fall, but part of a long sequence of adaptation within a changing world. The collapse of one system does not mean the end of habitation, but the beginning of a new configuration. And so, as regional networks contract and transform, Troy continues quietly within the shifting landscape, carrying forward traces of its earlier importance while adjusting to a reduced but enduring role in a world no longer structured in the same way as before. Across the centuries that follow the late Bronze Age transformation, movement does not stop in the region around Troy, it simply changes direction, speed, and structure. Populations shift in smaller groups rather than large coordinated systems. Coastal routes remain active, but with reduced long-distance integration, inland pathways continue to function, though more locally oriented. In this reshaped landscape, Troy is no longer a dominant gateway of an expansive network. But it still sits on a corridor that people continue to use, abandon, and return to again in different ways. It is within this context that evidence for migration and population movement becomes increasingly important. Archaeology does not preserve identities in the modern sense, but it does preserve traces of change in material culture that suggest the arrival or departure of groups. Variations in pottery styles, settlement layouts, and burial practices can all indicate shifting populations or cultural influences. In the centuries after Troy 7, these signals become more fluid, reflecting a world where boundaries are less rigid than in earlier palace-centered systems. One of the most discussed elements in this transitional phase is the emergence of cultural patterns often associated with groups labelled in ancient sources as the Sea Peoples. These groups appear in Egyptian records as external forces involved in widespread disruptions across the Eastern Mediterranean. However, the archaeological correlation between these textual references and specific material cultures remains uncertain. While some migration or movement of peoples is likely during this period, the scale, identity, and coherence of such groups remain debated among scholars. Troy itself does not provide direct evidence for a single identifiable migrating population replacing its inhabitants. Instead, What appears in the record is gradual change in material culture, consistent with broader regional trends. New ceramic styles emerge, older forms diminish, and settlement organisation continues to evolve. These shifts suggest interaction with changing external populations or influences, but not necessarily a single dramatic replacement event. The idea of large-scale migration events has often been used to explain the collapse of Bronze Age systems, but more recent interpretations tend to emphasise complexity. Movement of people likely occurred in multiple directions and at different scales, influenced by environmental stress, political instability, and economic opportunity. Rather than a single wave of migration, the evidence points to a long period of mobility and adjustment across the region. Within this environment of movement, Troy remains a point of continuity. Even as surrounding systems change, the site continues to be occupied in various forms. Its strategic position does not lose relevance entirely. Even if the scale of interaction is reduced, people still inhabit the hill, rebuild structures, and adapt the space to their needs. The archaeological record shows persistence rather than disappearance. This persistence is particularly important when considering how ancient places are remembered. Later, Greek traditions would come to view Troy as a site defined by a single monumental conflict, but the archaeological reality suggests a much longer and more fragmented history. By the time these literary traditions emerge, the site has already undergone centuries of transformation, reuse, and reinterpretation. The gap between memory and material reality becomes especially visible in how later cultures frame earlier disruptions. What archaeology reveals as multiple episodes of change over time is often condensed in cultural memory into singular defining events. This is not a distortion in a simple sense, but a natural outcome of how oral traditions simplify complex histories for transmission across generations. In the case of Troy, this process of condensation produces a powerful narrative identity. The city becomes associated with a moment of ultimate conflict, even though its actual history is characterized by repeated cycles of change. This symbolic version of Troy does not replace the archaeological reality, but it overlays it, creating a dual existence, one grounded in material continuity, the other in narrative transformation. During the early Iron Age, the settlement at Hisarlik continues to evolve. The scale of occupation varies over time, reflecting changing regional conditions. Some phases show more substantial building activity, while others suggest reduced density or more limited use of the site. Yet there is no clear point at which the location is fully abandoned. Instead, it transitions through different forms of habitation. Material evidence from this period indicates simpler construction techniques compared to earlier Bronze Age phases. Buildings are less monumental, and urban organisation is less formalised. However, this does not imply cultural stagnation. Rather, it reflects a shift in priorities and available resources. Communities adapt to new economic and political realities, reshaping how space is used and organised. Trade, while reduced in scale compared to earlier periods, does not disappear entirely. Regional exchange continues, though with more localised networks. Goods circulate within narrower geographic ranges, and long-distance imports become less frequent. This reflects the broader post-Bronze Age restructuring of Mediterranean connectivity, rather than a complete breakdown of interaction. Religious and symbolic practices also continue to evolve during this time. While direct evidence is limited, the presence of figurines, ritual deposits, and structured spatial arrangements suggest ongoing forms of belief and communal practice. These practices are less standardised than those of earlier palace-centred systems, but they remain integral to daily life. One of the most significant aspects of this transitional period is the gradual reshaping of identity at the site. Troy is no longer defined primarily by its role in large-scale exchange networks or fortified political systems. Instead, it becomes a more localised settlement embedded within regional patterns of life. Its earlier prominence is not erased, but it is no longer the dominant feature of its existence. This shift illustrates an important principle in long-term settlement history. Continuity does not require stability and form. A place can persist across centuries while changing dramatically in function, scale, and significance. Troy embodies this principle clearly. It remains occupied, but its role in the surrounding world evolves repeatedly. As time progresses, the accumulation of earlier layers becomes increasingly visible in the physical structure of the site. Later inhabitants build over, around, and sometimes directly into the remains of earlier phases. This creates a landscape in which past and present are physically intertwined. The hill itself becomes a layered archive of human adaptation. By the time classical Greek writers begin to reflect on Troy, the site they imagine is already distant from its earlier archaeological realities. It exists more as a cultural reference point than as a fully understood settlement. The physical remains, though still present, are interpreted through the lens of inherited tradition rather than direct knowledge of its complex history. This divergence between archaeological continuity and cultural memory is not unique to Troy, but it is particularly pronounced here. Few sites in the ancient world carry such a strong symbolic identity, layered over such a long and complex occupational history. The result is a place that exists simultaneously in material persistence and narrative abstraction. In the end, what emerges from this period is not a story of migration replacing one population with another in a single moment, but a long and uneven process of movement, adaptation, and continuity. People come and go, influences shift, and material culture changes, but the site itself remains a constant point within a changing world. Troy, in this sense, becomes less a fixed entity and more a continuous thread running through multiple historical transformations. Its identity is not defined by any single population or period, but by its endurance across cycles of change that reshape everything around it. And as the centuries continue to pass, the hill at Hisarlik quietly holds these overlapping histories together, not as a unified narrative, but as a layered accumulation of human presence, movement, and memory that never fully resolves into a single story. By the time the world of Troy enters its later classical and post-classical phases, the city no longer exists as a dominant regional power, yet it has not vanished from the landscape either. Instead, it persists in quieter forms of occupation, its scale reduced, its influence localized, but its presence never entirely erased. What remains is not the fortified citadel of Bronze Age memory, but a settlement that continues to be reshaped by the same geography that once made it significant. The physical hill of Hisarlik still stands in the same strategic position, overlooking the plains that stretch toward the Dardanelles. Even when political systems change and populations shift, the land itself does not lose its logic. Routes still converge, movement still passes nearby. The conditions that once supported a major settlement continue to exist, even if the scale of human organisation around them has transformed. In the centuries following the Bronze Age transformations, the settlement at Troy evolves into a more modest urban form. Archaeological evidence from later phases shows reduced architectural ambition, with simpler building techniques and less monumental construction. Walls are rebuilt in smaller forms, and domestic structures become more compact. The city no longer reflects the scale of earlier fortified phases, but it continues to function as a living settlement. This continuity is important because it challenges the idea that Troy experienced a definitive end. Instead of a single moment of disappearance, what appears is a gradual reduction in complexity. The site does not cease to be inhabited, it changes how it is inhabited. Functions that once operated on a larger regional scale become more localized and limited in scope. During the classical Greek period, Troy begins to acquire a new layer of meaning that is less archaeological and more cultural. Greek writers and travellers encounter the site not as a contemporary major city, but as a place associated with an earlier heroic past. By this time, much of its Bronze Age history is already distant and partially obscured, preserved only through oral tradition and inherited stories. This is where the transformation of Troy into symbolic landscape intensifies. The physical remains are still visible, but their interpretation is shaped increasingly by literary memory. The city becomes associated with the events described in epic tradition. Even though its actual archaeological history spans far beyond any single narrative moment, the landscape and the story begin to merge in cultural imagination. What is particularly striking is how earlier material layers continue to influence later perceptions. Massive walls from earlier phases remain visible in parts of the site, even when partially buried or repurposed. These imposing remnants would have naturally inspired awe and speculation among later visitors. Without precise historical knowledge, such structures are easily reinterpreted as relics of a heroic age. At the same time, the surrounding region continues to function within broader geopolitical networks. The Dardanelles remains a key strategic passage, and control over nearby territories continues to matter in regional politics. While Troy itself no longer plays a central role in these systems, its location still carries strategic relevance, even if on a reduced scale. Archaeologically, this period is characterized by continuity in occupation rather than dramatic expansion. The settlement does not grow into a major urban center again, but neither does it become completely abandoned. Instead, it persists as a smaller community embedded within shifting regional structures. Its importance becomes more symbolic and localized than economic or political. One of the more subtle aspects of this phase is the reuse of earlier architectural material. Stones from older structures are incorporated into newer buildings, creating a physical layering of history within the fabric of the settlement. This reuse is not just practical, but also contributes to the visual blending of different historical periods within the same space. Over time, this accumulation of reused material and partial structures creates a landscape in which the boundaries between different eras become increasingly blurred. Later inhabitants live among the remnants of earlier civilizations without necessarily distinguishing them as separate historical phases. For them, the site is continuous, even if its past is layered. This physical continuity contrasts with the increasing abstraction of Troy in cultural memory. As literary traditions develop and spread, the city becomes more strongly associated with a singular narrative identity. The complexity of its archaeological past is gradually compressed into a more unified story centered on conflict, endurance, and eventual fall. Yet the archaeological record does not support a clean separation between these identities. Instead, it reveals overlapping phases of occupation that resist simplification. The same location contains evidence of multiple communities across centuries, each adapting the space in different ways. The result is not a single city with a single history, but a succession of cities sharing the same ground. In this sense, Troy functions less as a static historical object and more as a palimpsest. Each generation writes over the previous one, but traces of earlier writing remain visible beneath the surface. The site is therefore both accumulation and transformation, preserving fragments of its past even as it is continuously reshaped. The persistence of occupation also reflects the enduring significance of geography. Even when political or cultural systems change, the physical advantages of the location do not disappear. A hill remains a natural vantage point, The surrounding plains remain fertile, and the nearby waterways continue to structure movement and access. These conditions ensure that the site retains a baseline level of relevance. However, relevance does not always translate into prominence. Over time, other centres in the region rise in importance, and Troy becomes one among many settlements rather than a dominant node. Its role becomes more peripheral, though still connected to broader regional dynamics. As classical authors reflect on the region, they inherit a landscape already shaped by centuries of reinterpretation. What they see is not the Bronze Age city in its full complexity, but a place filtered through layers of memory, storytelling, and partial survival. The result is a historical image that blends observation with inherited narrative. This blending is crucial to understanding how Troy comes to occupy its unique position in cultural history. It is both a real settlement with a long archaeological sequence and a symbolic site embedded in literary tradition. Neither identity fully replaces the other, instead they coexist, shaping how the site is perceived and remembered. Even as later periods move further away from the Bronze Age context, the material remains continue to anchor interpretation. Walls, foundations, and artifact deposits remain physical evidence of long-term occupation. These remains resist complete narrative abstraction, continually reintroducing complexity into what might otherwise become simplified memory. Ultimately, the story of Troy in this phase is not one of disappearance, but of transformation into layered presence. The city becomes quieter, smaller, and more fragmented, yet it remains embedded in both landscape and memory. Its history does not end, it disperses across time, becoming part of a broader continuum of human occupation. And within that continuum, Troy remains what it has always been, a place shaped by its position between worlds, continuously redefined by those who lived there, passed through it, or later imagined it. By the time historians and poets of the classical Greek world begin to speak about Troy with confidence, the site they are referring to already carries layers of interpretation that stretch far beyond direct memory. The city is no longer simply a settlement on a hill in northwestern Anatolia. It has become a reference point shaped by centuries of storytelling, partial survival, and cultural projection. What emerges is not a single coherent image of Troy, but a shifting blend of observation, inherited tradition, and imaginative reconstruction. For writers such as Homer, or the traditions that later preserved his work, Troy exists primarily as a narrative structure rather than a geographic complexity. It is a fortified city, wealthy and powerful, set against a coalition of attackers from across the sea. Within this framework, the city functions as both setting and symbol. It represents endurance, pride, and ultimately vulnerability. Yet this narrative form necessarily simplifies what archaeology reveals as a deeply stratified and long-lived settlement. The gap between literary Troy and archaeological Troy is not simply a matter of accuracy versus error. It is a difference in purpose. Epic tradition is designed to preserve cultural meaning, not stratigraphic detail. It compresses time, merges events, and prioritizes thematic coherence over chronological precision. Archaeology, by contrast, expands time, separating layers of occupation into distinct phases that often resist narrative unification. This divergence becomes especially clear when considering the scale of destruction described in literary sources compared to the archaeological record. The epic tradition presents a single, defining conflict that brings about the fall of the city. Archaeology, however, shows repeated episodes of damage and rebuilding across centuries, with no single horizon of destruction that aligns cleanly with the literary account. Instead, multiple layers show signs of stress, each with different characteristics and possible causes. The interpretation of Troy in the classical imagination is also shaped by its visible remains. Even in later periods, parts of the ancient fortifications would have still been partially standing, or at least traceable in the landscape. Massive stone foundations, irregular mounds, and scattered architectural fragments would have created a physical reminder of an earlier urban scale far larger than contemporary settlements in the immediate vicinity. These remnants naturally invite speculation. Without access to systematic archaeological understanding, later observers would have interpreted these remains through the lens of inherited stories. Large walls become associated with heroic builders, ruins become evidence of legendary conflict. The absence of precise historical knowledge allows material traces to be absorbed into narrative frameworks already in circulation. In this way, physical evidence and cultural memory reinforce each other, even when they do not align chronologically. As Greek historiography develops, attempts are made to situate Troy within a broader historical framework. Early historians seek to reconcile epic tradition with emerging concepts of chronology and causation. Some treat the Trojan War as a real historical event, albeit one embellished over time. Others approach it more cautiously, recognizing the difficulty of extracting precise historical fact from poetic tradition. This tension reflects an early stage in the development of historical thinking itself. Meanwhile, the site of Troy continues to exist as a physical location, even as its interpretation becomes increasingly abstract. The settlement does not vanish entirely, but its role within regional systems remains limited compared to earlier periods. It functions more as a local community than a major political or economic centre, yet its symbolic importance grows in inverse proportion to its material prominence. This divergence between symbolic significance and physical scale is one of the defining features of Troy's later history. The less it functions as a major urban centre, the more it becomes a cultural reference point. Its identity shifts from economic and strategic importance to narrative and symbolic resonance. This transformation is gradual, not abrupt, and it unfolds over many generations. Archaeologically, the later layers of the site continue to show occupation, reuse, and modification of earlier structures. This continuity indicates that the site remained relevant to local populations, even as its broader regional role diminished. Houses are built, repaired, and adapted within the constraints of earlier architectural remains. The landscape remains inhabited, even if on a reduced scale. At the same time, the accumulated presence of earlier monumental phases continues to shape perception. The remnants of large fortifications and dense stratigraphy create a sense of depth that distinguishes the site from its surroundings. Even without precise historical knowledge, such features suggest an extraordinary past. This perception feeds into the development of mythic association. One of the most important aspects of this process is the way memory becomes spatially anchored. Unlike purely textual traditions, which exist independently of physical location, the memory of Troy is tied to a specific landscape. The hill at Hisarlik serves as a persistent point of reference, allowing stories to remain grounded in a real place even as their details evolve over time. This grounding effect helps explain why Troy maintains such a strong presence in later cultural traditions. It is not only a story that is remembered, but a place that can be visited, observed, and interpreted. The physical landscape provides continuity even as historical understanding changes. This interplay between place and narrative ensures that Troy remains part of cultural consciousness across centuries. However, this continuity also introduces layers of reinterpretation that accumulate over time. Each generation encounters both the physical remains and the inherited stories, and each interprets them through its own intellectual framework. As a result, the meaning of Troy is never fixed. It is continuously reconstructed at the intersection of evidence and imagination. In this sense, Troy becomes less a single historical entity and more a long-term cultural process. It exists simultaneously as an archaeological site, a literary reference, and a symbolic landscape. These identities overlap without fully merging, creating a complex structure of meaning that resists simple resolution. The classical period thus represents a key moment in this transformation. It is the stage at which physical remnants, oral tradition, and emerging historical thought begin to interact in more systematic ways. Yet even at this stage, the separation between myth and history is not absolute. Instead, they coexist within a shared interpretive space. Over time, this coexistence becomes one of Troy's defining characteristics. It is both real and imagined, both excavated and narrated, both local and universal. Its identity is not confined to any single period or interpretation, but emerges from the accumulation of all of them. As attention gradually shifts away from Troy as a functioning settlement and toward Troy as a cultural symbol, the site enters a new phase of existence. It is no longer defined primarily by its economic or strategic role, but by its position within the collective memory of civilizations that continue to reinterpret its meaning. And beneath this evolving cultural framework, the physical remains of the city continue to lie in layers, preserving traces of all the lives that once passed through it, long before it became a story. Beneath the quiet surface of Hisarlik today, Troy no longer presents itself as a single city waiting to be rediscovered. It exists instead as a dense accumulation of time, where every layer of soil holds traces of different lives, different systems, and different versions of what the place once was. By the time all the myths, excavations, and reinterpretations are placed alongside the archaeological record, what emerges is not a simple answer to what Troy was, but a far more complex realization of what it became through centuries of change. The final layers of occupation show a settlement that has moved far away from the scale of its earlier Bronze Age peak. Structures are smaller, more fragmented, and often built directly atop earlier remains without clear separation from the past. This physical closeness to earlier civilizations creates a landscape where time is not linear, but stacked. People live literally above the ruins of earlier worlds, sometimes unaware of their full significance, sometimes repurposing them for immediate needs. Even in these reduced phases, the site continues to reflect the enduring importance of its geography. The hill remains a natural point of observation over the surrounding plains, and the nearby routes still guide movement between regions. While the large-scale trade networks of the Bronze Age no longer operate in the same form, the fundamental logic of the landscape has not disappeared. Troy continues to exist because the conditions that first made it significant have never fully gone away. Over time, however, its identity shifts decisively from functional centre to historical reference. As larger political and economic systems develop elsewhere, Troy becomes less central to active regional networks and more embedded in memory and interpretation. Its earlier importance does not vanish, but it is gradually recontextualized through stories, texts, and later, historical imagination. By the time modern archaeology fully engages with the site, this long process of reinterpretation has already shaped expectations. Excavators do not approach an empty hill, but a place already loaded with meaning. Each trench cut into the soil is therefore not just an encounter with ancient material, but also a confrontation with centuries of accumulated narrative. What the excavation ultimately reveals is a reality more intricate than either myth or early historical reconstruction had imagined. Troy is not a single city destroyed in a singular war, nor is it merely a symbolic invention detached from historical grounding. It is a sequence of settlements, each responding to different pressures, each adapting to changing conditions, and each leaving behind fragments that later generations would assemble into larger stories. Across its long history, certain patterns remain consistent: the importance of location, the role of trade and movement, the vulnerability to environmental and structural disruption, and the repeated capacity for rebuilding after collapse. These patterns create continuity across discontinuity, allowing the site to persist even as its form and function change dramatically over time. One of the most important insights from the full archaeological sequence is that destruction is never final in the way later narratives often suggest. At Troy, endings are followed by returns, collapse is followed by reconstruction. Even when the scale of occupation diminishes, the site itself continues to attract human presence. This persistence complicates any attempt to define a single moment of fall. Instead, what emerges is a long process of transformation in which stability is temporary and change is constant. The city is repeatedly redefined by those who inhabit it, rebuild it, or remember it. Its identity is therefore not fixed in any single phase, but distributed across all of them. As modern understanding of Troy matures, the relationship between archaeology and mythology becomes less about contradiction and more about layering. Myth does not replace material evidence, and material evidence does not erase myth. Instead, they exist as parallel systems of meaning, each reflecting different ways in which human societies engage with the past. Archaeology reveals the complexity of lived reality households, economies, repairs, adaptations, and gradual transformations. Myth reveals how that complexity is later organized into narrative form conflict, resolution, memory, and symbolic meaning. Neither is sufficient on its own to fully explain Troy, but together they illuminate different dimensions of the same place. Standing on the hill today, there is no visible trace of the epic city described in poetry, nor a single moment frozen in time waiting to be uncovered. What exists instead is a landscape shaped by accumulation. Soil layered over soil, walls built over older walls, lives built over forgotten lives, each layer quietly preserving its own version of the place. The final understanding of Troy, then, is not a discovery of a hidden truth beneath myth, but an acceptance of complexity. It is a recognition that some places do not resolve into simple stories because they were never simple to begin with. They are shaped by geography, time, human movement, and memory in ways that resist closure. Troy endures not because it tells one story, but because it holds many at once. A settlement, a crossroads, a ruin, a symbol, a memory. Each layer adds depth without replacing what came before, and in that accumulation, the site becomes something larger than any single interpretation. In the end, what was really inside Troy was not only treasure, or walls, or war, or myth. It was continuity, the quiet, persistent presence of human life returning again and again to the same ground, building, losing, rebuilding, and leaving behind traces that would eventually become history. And as the wind moves across the plains of Anatolia, the hill of Hisalit remains, holding all of it at once, the city that was never just one city, and the story that was never just one story.